guys, welcome back to another episode of Midwest Whitetail. On this week's episode, we kick things off, as you just saw, taking a trip down memory lane and some of our favorite rut footage. You know, it's the middle of June here. Gavin's been working on Chasing November, and we just finished up, as you saw in last week's episode, our annual team meeting. And that's kind of the unofficial kickoff and reminder that deer season is incoming, and that gets us talking. You know, we're talking about past encounters, past memories, and that's how we landed on what we're talking about this week's show. And what we're talking about on this week's show is calling, deer communication, and kind of just some of our takes and our experiences, what we've learned. And hopefully, as you go through this, you take something away from it that can help you when you make a decision this coming fall, whether to call, how to call, what situations and stand locations you can look for. And the style of how we're going to do this is a little bit different than we've ever done in the past, but we're basically just going to go person to person to person, ask a few questions, and hope you enjoy this week's episode. Let's get to it now. All right, first up, when is the best time to call and why do we like this time?
The best time to call for me is kind of a two-part answer. I've got a time of the year I really like. I also have a time of the day. But as far as the time of the year, you know, a lot of these things that we really like as far as timing and how to call and that kind of stuff is because we've had success doing that. So if you go back to where I've had the most success, it's been probably November 1st through about the 11th. Is when I've called in the most deer, and so that would be my favorite time to call. But you know, primarily that's when I've been able to hunt the most too, you know, being that I was working a lot and I never got out of the pool business until maybe the 1st of November. I didn't get to hunt October much. These last 4 or 5 years I've got to hunt October more, and I might pick that last week of October over November. You know, none of them are doed up, or virtually none of them. And so they're all available, they're all getting ramped up into that hard pre-rut, you know, leading into the rut. And so they're pretty susceptible to calling that time of year as well. So as far as time of day, I really like calling in the morning, like first light, because you know probably 90% of the bucks or more, maybe all of them, are up on their feet at that time of day. I've called in a lot of bucks, rattled them in at that time, so I guess that's why I'm partial to it.
Well, there's a lot of variables that go into this answer. And some of those, you know, I grew up hunting in Louisiana. I've hunted public ground growing up. You know, now I'm primarily hunting private. I've hunted all over the Midwest. You know, there's a lot of different things, like whether it's, you know, how pressured the farm is, what the buck to doe ratio or the sex ratio is on the farm. In general though, on my farms here in Iowa right now, and really anywhere I hunt, I prefer to call most during the pre-rut time frame. So that's late October, early November here in Iowa. You got all these bucks looking for that first available doe. I've had success post-rut, obviously during the rut. I've called deer in December, Thanksgiving. So a lot of it is still boils down to knowing your area, and each buck is different, how they might respond to a call. So knowing some of the personalities of different bucks, I mean, that's a luxury of hunting private land, is, you know, you pass these deer year over year, you can start to get to know their personalities. And a lot of it too is reading body language from a deer, you know, what the scenario is that day. But in general, I'm gonna go pre-rut, and it has a lot to do with those mature bucks looking for that first available doe.
My favorite time to call is probably mid-November to late November. When you get into the middle to late November, it seems like those bucks are always looking for a doe. There's less does that are in heat. Some does have already been bred, obviously, and those bigger bucks are gonna be a lot more aggressive in late rut. It'd probably be that last week and a half of November for me.
All right, time to jump into the second round of questions. What do we look for in a good calling setup, and what are the best conditions?
So for me, a good calling setup has a lot of thick stuff around the tree, a lot of brushy stuff where a deer can't see in. So when you're calling to them, you want them to not be able to see what's down there. So I mean, obviously piques their curiosity, they want to come down and investigate. My ideal spot was where they can't get downwind easily, and there's thick cover around where they can't see what's going on down there. For conditions, I like lower winds where it's pretty quiet. You know, still, and that doesn't have to be still, but fairly quiet, because I want that sound to carry. So if I'm blind calling, rattling or whatever, I've actually seen deer respond from over a mile away. I could see them, and it's quiet conditions, you hit those antlers, you see them look and start your way. So, I mean, conditions like that, you just have a lot more area you're drawing from.
In general, the idea behind a good calling setup would be a situation where it's very difficult for that buck to get downwind of you. I mean, that's the main thing. So, you know, here on this property on the river bottom against the river is nice. They're not gonna generally be able to swing downwind of you. The other thing would be ground cover. You know, if you're in a real open area and they can see from a far distance away and be able to tell that there's not a deer there or not see what is potentially making that sound, often that is not going to be successful. So you want some good ground cover. You want the deer to have to come to you to look and see what was making that noise. Those are the two biggest keys as far as ideal setups. And then I would say relatively calm winds, you know, low to medium sort of wind where it's not too noisy. I mean, if it's a real blustery day, 20+ miles per hour, you're gonna have trouble getting deer to hear the calls.
One setup just off the top of my head that is my favorite setup ever, and Collins knows why. It's the setup that Collins shot his wide 9 out of.
What do you want to do? Here, ready? He's gonna come in. Hear him? I'm all over him, don't even ask. It's gonna be a 30-yard. I'm not on it. I'm on him.
Came to the base of the freaking tree. And he just came into 5 yards at the base of the tree. Yeah! We just smoked a giant, dude.
The reason why it's so good is because it has a steep bank and a steep ledge that rolls down into a creek right back behind the stand. So after seeing Collins' buck, we elected to snort wheeze as soon as he got behind some cover because he was within 50 yards of us. And it's really key that you have some kind of cover in between, that way those deer can't pinpoint exactly where that sound is and see you and get a little flustered. So after we snort wheeze, he came all the way in to 5 yards because he can't see past that creek. And once he got to that creek, he was scanning, trying to look for that buck that was trying to challenge him. Then just another hour later, after Collins had shot that deer, we grunted at another 4.5-year-old, and he did the same exact thing, came right to the edge, didn't see anything, and worked off. And that's why it's my favorite stand, just because of that steep ledge. The deer cannot see past where we are calling, so they have to commit all the way to the ledge That's what I look for in my favorite stand setup or best calling setup. Trying to get some type of way, whether it be plot screen, shrubbery, just in between you and that deer, that way it makes them commit all the way to you.
What do I look for in a good calling setup, and what are the best conditions? You know, when I think about that answer, obviously time of year plays a big role in what factors to consider. But as I answered question number one, that late October time frame, the October 25th, 31st, pre-rut, it's definitely developed into one of my favorite times. And as I think about the conditions, you know, it's still October. I'm not gonna be diving into my best spots every chance I have to hunt. And so it's no secret, you know, you've heard this probably talked about a lot, cold fronts are what my main focus are. Typically, some sort of northerly wind is associated with that. And so as I start to think about what am I looking for in a calling setup, first and foremost, I want to find a spot that I can get into and get out of cleanly with those associated north winds. If I'm blowing deer out on the way in, that's not gonna do me any good for the hunt that's upcoming. And if I'm blowing deer on the way out, that's gonna hurt me even more if I wanna come back and try again. And so that's helped me eliminate over the years a lot of spots not to hunt. So now that I've found a stand location that I can hunt on these cold fronts, the next set of variables that I'm considering is, can I find a food source tight to bedding? You know, and another example that comes to my mind is the public land bean field that I've hunted over the years. You know, I was able to kill a buck there in 2018. All these factors are at play. I can access it perfectly from the west, get in there. All of my bedding that's close to that Beanfield Cove is off to the north and the east, and a lot of those deer make their way in. And as I get into that late October time frame, I need something that allows me to close the distance. And, you know, I go back to that October 30th hunt. I was able to send a grunt towards that buck, snore wheeze, and then grunt down the tree line, and that was able to seal the deal for me. So it's nothing, you know, there's no rocket science to it. It's just something that's worked for me, and, you know, again, something that I'm keying in on in that time frame. All right, question number 3. Why should I or shouldn't I call it a deer?
Why you should call at a deer is a lot of times you have them in sight at that time. You're calling to them visually, you can see them over there. So you've got them that close already. You don't want them to slip through your fingers at that time. The opportunity is right there in front of you, so if you have nothing to lose, you might as well try to call and see if you can bring them in. The reason not to call is you're gonna tip them off that something's over there, then all of a sudden you're the hunted instead of the hunter. They're coming in looking for something, looking for another deer. A lot of times they're gonna circle downwind or they're gonna spot you more easily. So a perfect example of maybe when not to call is like the Wolverine hunt last year. Lost your girl. Say the stand site is money. They've been just piling right past us here, so we just gotta get the right deer. Come on, baby. Come this way. Yeah. Oh my gosh, warriors. Whoa. I cannot believe that. 4 4 years hunting that buck. That's hard to believe. Either he was really elusive or I'm a really bad hunter. I don't know which, but it took me a long time to get him. Oh my gosh. You know, that hunt was condensed down, but that was 5 or 6 minutes of us just watching that deer, just standing there, looking around. But you know, he could have went 50 different directions, but he never turned to walk away. Had he done that, I would have called to him and tried to bring him in. But because he never did and he looked like he was going to angle our way, I just let him keep coming. So if he doesn't give us a reason to call to him, I'm not going to tip him off to our presence. And that's exactly the way that played out. He just kept angling and angling closer and closer. And so I never needed to call to him. But you know, it's always kind of last resort. If you have to call, then I'll call. Unless you have a bulletproof setup, then sometimes it's first resort.
This is another one that you'll find quite a bit of variation in people's answers, but you know, painting a picture of whether or not to call at a specific deer situationally, the general concept of that is you don't want to end up scaring the deer away, right? The goal is to get him in the bow range, and there's a lot of situations where, you know, when I first started hunting, you'd see the buck you want to shoot and you'd just start calling at him, trying to get him in the bow range. And I think a lot of hunters tend to overcall. It's pretty easy. I mean, these old bucks are pretty smart, and if the situation's not quite right, like we talked about in the last question, a lot of times it can hurt you more than help you. But we had a hunt in this very food plot that was an example of that. We had does in the food plot under us, and I saw Kelsey last year out in the brush. It's just a difficult situation to call in. I mean, you could do a few soft calls to get his attention, but I don't want to risk getting the does blowing and running off and then him just following them. So I put my chips in the bucket of, you know, I've got does at 15 yards and it's pre-rut, and he's probably going to come scent check them. You know, I tried calling at him once I knew he was working off, especially when they're 80 to 100 yards off. I've had a lot more success letting deer get a little bit farther away from me and then calling them back than trying to call to them when they're already in the bubble. You know, if they can't see or hear again what they're looking at, or they're pretty good at pinpointing where that sound is and how far away it is. And so if you've got a deer relatively close, it's very difficult to call them in. They'll stop there, they'll look around, they'll survey, they'll wait, and then, you know, they'll get out of there. So I've had more success over the last, you know, decade of, if I see a buck that I want to shoot and here he's coming cruising but he's not in bow range, I'll try to let him get 100, 150 yards off and then call him back. It's obviously, there's a lot of variation in what you might experience, but the goal is to get him in the bow range and not scare him off.
So I think there's a lot of ways you can answer this. You know, personality goes into it. Do you know the deer? Do you not know the deer? Is he on a doe? Is he off a doe? Is he looking for a doe? But one thing that I talked about last year that is kind of a rule of thumb for me of whether or not I'm gonna call it that deer or not is there some kind of cover within 100 yards distance where this deer cannot see everything in front of me. If that deer is looking head on with me or there is no cover within 100 yards, I'm not gonna call it that deer because they are so good at pinpointing that sound, they're just gonna pick you off. Now, one way that I kind of used this last year, you know, it didn't end up working for me, but we didn't educate the deer, was Hog Jr. came in, I wanna say it was November 11th, and he came in, gave us an opportunity at 35, 40 yards. It was super still and super quiet. If I would have called at him when I knew he was starting to veer off and not come by the stand, I'm sure that he would have pinpointed exactly where we are because there was nothing in between us at the beginning. But we let that deer work off to about 60 to 80 yards. That's when I started with a grunt, just a trailing grunt. And then I went into a snort wheeze. He showed some kind of signs of aggression. Normally when I see a buck working a scrape, I'm always gonna snort wheeze at him first. So in my eyes, that deer is already in an aggressive state if he is working a scrape, just like that hunt from Collins's. And as soon as we snort wheeze, 9 times out of 10, we're gonna get his curiosity and he's gonna commit towards the stand. So that's my rule of thumb when choosing whether or not to call it a deer. If he is within 100 yards, I will not call it him if there's no cover in between him and I, just because I do not want to educate that deer and I do not want him to spook.
Why shouldn't I call it a deer? You know, as you've heard Owen and Mike and Caleb talk about, there's a lot of variables to consider. And first and foremost for me, the biggest one that I've noticed over the years is really just trying to read a buck's demeanor. You hope that you're hunting a location where he is giving you enough information. And one that sticks out to me is a spot where I really made a big mistake, I think, in calling is going back to 2019. We're talking about that same exact bean field location that I introduced in question number 2. And on this particular hunt, it was the middle of October, so a little bit earlier than that time frame I discussed. And I was back in there after that Big 10 that I had seen a couple of times. On that particular night, we had a cold front. It was a great win for him. I had gone across the field hoping to set up over the scrape that I was getting pictures of him on. And to keep a long story short, he stepped out well before the end of legal shooting time. And for whatever reason, you know, I just had this notion in my head that if I grunted behind me, right by the scrape, this was gonna fire up that buck. He was gonna come over to us. And it did pretty much everything but that. You know, looking back at the situation, he steps out super calm, very easy going demeanor. And he stepped out with another buck that we thought was 4.5 and they're feeding side by side. So why I felt like sending some grunts his way was the necessary thing to do, I don't really know. I mean, ultimately he ended up spooking. I don't know if it was well after I did the grunts, but you can see when I grunted that he definitely perked his ears, he heard us. Again, one of those situations where like, I don't think it was necessary to call in any sort of right. And I think it ultimately cost a chance at that deer because we had enough time. I should have just let him do his thing. And I go back to that time of year, it wasn't quite to that late October time frame. You know, there's a lot that goes on in that 10-day span, you know, when I think it was the 16th or so, getting into, you know, that pre-rut ramp up where they're a lot more aggressive. All right, jumping into our final question here. How do I know what call or techniques I should use?
As far as what call to use, I like to escalate things. I don't like to start out real aggressive, and I'm gonna read their body language all the time. You know, speaking of escalating your calling or not letting them slip through your fingertips, that Stickers buck from 2021 I shot on Halloween evening, he was a good example of the opportunity was right there. He comes out about 40 yards. I was gonna take that shot, but right as I came to full draw, he turned and quartered away real hard, so it just wasn't a good angle. I let down and let him walk off. Once he got out of view in that corn, then I started throwing everything but the kitchen sink at him, you know, snort, wheeze, grunt, rattle, and he didn't respond immediately. I thought he'd come running right back in, but he didn't. He looped up around the corn, and you'll see he come walking down the hill, and he was looking for the source of that calling and walked almost to the base of the tree. So that's just what it can do for you. It's a lot of fun besides, you know. If you don't call much, give it a try. It's a really good time, especially if you rattle one in. First thing in the morning, you hear him walking before you see him. Just a lot of fun.
So there's a lot of different techniques that I use, but it's all based off of a deer's personality and what that deer's currently doing. If I see a buck that's in a scrape, or I know that's a dominant buck in the area, he's a very aggressive buck, 9 times out of 10, I'm gonna start with a snort wheeze. If a buck's just cruising, I don't know the deer, he's just off in the distance, within 100 yards, I'm gonna grunt at that buck to start. Depending on the time of the year, I might switch. If I get his curiosity, he looks, he keeps rolling, I might try a breeding grunt or I might try a doe bleat. But my favorite style of calling is rattling. One hunt that stood out to me this past year was the guards encounter that I had in mid-November. I've kind of learned that Doe Estrous Call, when those bucks get within 80 to 100 yards, man, it's a really good follow-up call, and it just paints the picture that there's a doe there as well. And that's the whole reason why they're out and about stomping all hours of the day in November. They're looking for a doe. But that's just a few techniques that's helped me over the years. Calling is just really trial and error. The best way to get good at calling is to start calling a deer, and you're gonna learn a lot of stuff like I did and all the errors that I made as I was younger. So it's all situational. You just have to read that buck's body language and make a decision.
I think there's a couple of ways to categorize this. The first bifurcation would be blind calling versus, calling at a deer that you can actually see. And then using a specific call, we'll go into that. I mean, I like to generally paint a picture of what might actually happen in the wild, where there's grunting, there might be a snort wheeze. I'm trying to paint a picture of 2 bucks interacting, leading up to a fight. So there might be doe bleats, there might be, grunting, the aggression escalates into snort wheeze, potentially rattling. But going back to blind calling, I've actually had a lot of success over the years blind calling. I think you really need to know, you need to have a really good setup where it's difficult for deer to be downwind of you. And also having a really good idea of how the deer use your property, where they bed, where the doe bedding areas are, where they tend to cruise. All this can help you feel, safe that you're blind calling and not actually spooking deer or having deer work their way in behind you. The strategy that I use in general when I'm doing all types of calling is you want to use a volume, the lowest volume possible that deer can hear, right? You don't want a deer to unknowingly be close and you are blowing on your grunt tube really loudly or banging antlers together. So I generally start off low volume and escalate. Again, it might be a couple grunts and a doe bleat followed by, I'm trying to paint a picture of 2 bucks or maybe about to fight, do a snort wheeze, and then I'll lead into some rattling. Well, I hope you guys learned something today. Every year we go over this topic and it's always fun to start talking about it and put some thought into what we learn each year and how we might modify our strategies. There are a lot of different ways to do this, obviously, but deer season's ever approaching and we're all getting excited as we count down towards deer season. We've been working out at the River Bottom Farm and all the farms really planting, and this year we're partnered with Vetter Equipment and Case IH, and I've been using a Farmall Case IH 120 horsepower tractor, and just couldn't say enough good things about it. It's been great for us. And right now at Veteran Equipment, they're running a deal through the end of June, and they may be extending this through the end of July, but they have 0% financing for up to 72 months on the Farmall Case IH tractors. And I know most of you guys know what the interest market is doing right now. I mean, it's at 8% or higher, and I'm surprised that they're offering such a sweet deal. So Veteran Equipment has multiple locations all across the Midwest. So, you know, if you're located somewhere in the Midwest, it's likely that there's one not too far from you. You can just search them on the internet and see what store is closest. It's been a great summer so far. The velvet bucks are starting to put on some inches of antler. It's exciting, those pictures are rolling in. Hopefully everybody's getting their work done. Happy Father's Day to everyone. Hopefully everyone had a great day yesterday. We're gonna keep plugging along here at the farm, and we'll see you guys back next week.